that I've created. I just want you to know that I'm a storyteller. Maybe not as quality a storyteller as David Petoniak is, if you've ever got to meet him. But he is someone that I've known a long, long time, and I think he's fantastic. So I do encourage you to attend that as well. Since I can't have you in my dating class, most of you probably. So, and Building Independence is just a phenomenal group of young adults that get together every Thursday evening via Zoom. And through the pandemic, it's been a fantastic outlet for myself and them. I would say that kind of we all get a ton out of it. So anyway, thanks, Brenda. I appreciate all that. Well, the first thing I had for you guys today is, as we look at, behavior being communication, the first thing we have to establish for people who are expressing their emotions, their feelings, their wants, desires, etc., through behavior is that immediately, if you can increase their quality of life, that you will decrease their problem behavior. So I was fortunate enough to get to see Dr. Ted Carr speak from University of New York Stony Brook, and that he had this amazing presentation. He was the keynote speaker at the International Positive Behavior Support Conference, which is another annual wonderful conference to attend if you ever have the freedom to do so. It'll probably be Zoom. Anyway, he stood up in front of 1,000 people who specialize in supporting people who experience different diagnoses. And this is what he put on the PowerPoint: was when quality of life goes up, problem behavior goes down, and challenging behavior decreases. And then he sat down and he said, if you can do that, you are on the right direction. You are in the correct road. You are moving to a path of support and happiness. So I just thought that was so simple and poignant. So it led me then to this. If a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to behave, what do we do? Well, it should be as automatic as any of those other statements. It should be we teach. But historically, in my entire career, I experienced many people who would say we punish. That rather than recognizing what the child is experiencing, lacking, struggling with, etc., we don't just automatically say, how do we teach them to say that? How do we teach them to do different? How do we teach the people around them to support them differently? All of that would be support and teaching. But we automatically say it without thinking to all those other more academic issues. But, having spent so much time working in schools and knowing that on many IEPs, I have social, emotional, behavioral, etc., that means we teach. So, and that doesn't end when school is done, when they graduate, although a lot of those services seem to. So to me, that's kind of why we all get together, is because the teaching doesn't end. We have to keep doing it. We have to keep supporting each other. We have to keep providing new information. And a lot of what we're going to go over in the next couple of days together, to me, is this foundation of support. Are we doing what this individual needs for us to do? And if not, how do we access that? How do we get more information? So next slide, please. So problem behaviors are often representational of a lack of skills. So it's not necessarily that we're talking about someone who wants to engage in what they're doing. It's they don't have a lot of other options that seem to be effective. So when people lack skills, we should teach them. As parents and support people, it's our responsibility to teach new and effective skills. So often that means we have to learn those new and effective skills. I always say in the first 5 years of my work with young people, I was just learning the work. I was just learning what to do. I was learning how to ebb and flow and individualize and all of those things to so many different people. The second 5 years, I was just trying to learn how to teach other people to do it while I kept learning. The third 5 years, you start to realize you have to be able to do this in a multitude of environments because these individuals are going everywhere. Therefore, you not only have to teach their teachers and their parents, you have to support the community to learn. And of course, you have to support the individual to learn. The next 5 years after that, now you're talking about multi-linguistic. You're talking about multiple languages and cultures and trying to do the same work in these different cultural aspects. And how do you apply what we do to support those different environments as well? So it is very, very layered to know that we're doing the right work for individuals. So sometimes we must ask for support in order to know what skills to teach and how exactly to teach them. I tell a funny story is that I was recruited to, as a huge blessing, I was recruited to go to Thailand to teach. I was going to go work in some schools over there, international schools. And so, what else? They gave me kind of a list of things they wanted me to go over with their staff. And so I was, oh, this is fantastic. It was about behaviors and diagnostics and strategies and how do you assess that and what would you do for each individual. So I went through the DSM and I put together this wonderful list and all the strategies that I would implement based on each one of those diagnoses. And I flew all the way to Thailand in a hurricane. I landed there after traveling for over 24 hours. I get to the hotel, I finish up my PowerPoint, I send it to the school, and they said, we don't use the DSM. I'm like, you don't use the Diagnostic Statistical Manual? And they're like, no, you're going to have to change everything. So I went back through those 64 slides, and instead of using any diagnostic terminology, I changed it all to the behavior that's exhibited. And that's what they use. They speak specific, not to the diagnosis, but to what behavior they see as communication. That was a cultural revelation for me. Like, oh, well, why don't we do that? Why does everybody have to have a label? Why do I have to know that, everyone with a label, then you should use these strategies with them? So that's why when I mentioned earlier, Liz, about multimodality, if you in my world, if you're a purist, it's going to be very difficult to succeed. You have to be a jack of all trades. In my world, I call it a zack of all trades. You have to at least know a little bit about everything for which to say, hey, you should try this. I think that might be best for this particular person, rather than being really, really an expert at one thing, because then you're leaving a lot of stones unturned, shall we say. So that experience of going to Thailand, I thought I was going to teach, and I really, again, as usual, went to learn. So it was a fantastic experience that just opened my eyes to say, oh gosh, I'm living in a box. And theirs was, and the other term they used often was same, but which means we're all the same, but different. And it's everywhere, same, but different, same, but different. And everybody said it. So it was a wonderful thing that actually then I was able to apply to my life here. So next slide, please. So the reality is, perhaps the hardest issue surrounding a positive behavior support approach is that the realization that oftentimes it is the behavior of a professional and the family members that needs to change to eliminate or decrease the problem behavior for individuals they support. So often, especially early on, I was asked often to, can you fix them? Can you make them change? Can you make them do this different? And obviously, no. I can make us do things different. It's a lot easier in schools and in residential because I can make them because they're paid to do it. So in order to put it into practice or even prove us wrong, you have to implement it for which to see if there's a positive result or not. So in families, there is no requirement of that. But what you do have is you have passion, you have love, you have desire. So it's not just the paid responsibility. Um, so usually, although harder when you're living the support life, the desire to support is better, it's higher. So there's a healthy balance in there somewhere when you collaborate, when everybody's working together, whether that be educational teams, residential teams, service coordination, medical teams, obviously the family. When all these people can come together and work for the same common goal, then you have everyone invested, and we can support each other to make the changes that that individual needs. So next slide, please. Probably the one thing that I've talked about more in my career, and I really thought this would go away at some point, is punishment. Um, from day one, I had a nice long drive. I was delivering Christmas gifts to needy families in Southern Oregon when I worked for the state, and we did individualized presents for unique people. So we wanted to make sure they got things that would be things they would love for Christmas. Everything from sensory equipment to communication devices. So you might see it as passionate yet functional. So I was driving down to Grants Pass, and I'm zipping down this giant hill in a state vehicle with a truckload full of Christmas presents, playing Santa Claus, loving life. And of course, what happens is I get the sirens behind me. Lights and sirens. I'm probably doing 80, guilty as charged. Just wasn't paying attention, listening to the radio in a state car, and I got pulled over, and the officer walks up to me and he says, where are you going with all these Christmas presents? And of course, I thought I would pull on his heartstrings and say, well, I'm delivering these presents because I'm a behavior specialist. I primarily work with kids with autism, and I'm trying to give underprivileged kids these wonderful gifts. And I thought, oh, he was going to say, gosh, you're doing great work, son. You need to, go do your job. And he says, have you ever tried spanking? That was his answer. So that was really eye-opening. I was like, oh gosh, okay, well, just give me the ticket, sir. Thank you so much. Because we were clearly coming from different philosophy and different mental states, even if it was just current status for him, right? I've had bad days myself where I might say it out loud, but obviously not do it. So if I give you this example, and I apologize if any of you have ever heard me use this before, because I think it's the best example of punishment there is. So now again, a year ago, when you used to get to drive somewhere regularly, and you would be driving down that stretch of road, and it well, like the back of your hand. So you might be kind of daydreaming or fiddling with things, or not doing what you would normally do, such as I was on I-5 that day, going a little too fast, not paying attention. And you realize that you're speeding a little bit when you see a police officer up ahead. So what's the first thing you do when you see the police officer? You put on the brakes. Well, actually, the first thing you do is you stop breathing, your heart rate goes up, your body temperature goes up, you get hyper focused, you start to panic. That's what really happens, and then you put on the brakes. So in that context, you see the punisher and you change your behavior, right? So now you're driving down the road, a different road, not somewhere you're familiar with. Because now I bet most of you who drive the same route, where the police hang out, right? They have a handful of spots. I'm always surprised when they're in somewhere different, but I know that stretch of road. I was just driving to Lincoln City. I was going through Sheridan by the federal penitentiary, and I'm like, you know what? I know this stretch of road. There's going to be a police officer here. And sure enough, there was. And I hadn't driven that road in over a year. But the police officer was still there. I bet he'd been sitting there the whole year. So if I'm driving on a different road, I don't have that ability. I don't just generalize, right? So do I monitor my speed the same way? Because I know to slow down in certain areas, even though I'm a pretty law-abiding citizen and I tend to drive the speed limit, I also get caught up in the speed of traffic or in a hurry. So if I'm driving down that same road and I don't slow down and I forget and I'm daydreaming and I'm in a hurry and I'm trying to get to work and I get pulled over by the police officer and I get that ticket that he gave me there at Jump Off Joe Creek and I-5 on Grants Pass, do you think that after I get that $150 ticket, that I'm going to drive really slow for the rest of eternity? Am I going to drive really slow for the rest of the day? Well, what are the odds that now that I'm 15, 20 minutes late, that I'm actually going to go even slower to my destination? What is the odds, because we're often very data collecting mental people, what is the odds of us getting 2 tickets on the same stretch of road in the same day? Right? Don't you play the odds sometimes? I mean, intermittent reinforcement, just like intermittent punishment, is kind of the same thing. That's why Vegas is so huge. Vegas is telling you they're taking your money. Just look at it. Right? There's no secret there. People aren't going there and winning all the time. People are going there and losing all the time. But yet people still go, even in a pandemic. So what happens is, instead of that generalizing and saying, oh, I'm not going to drive fast anymore, it actually sometimes makes you drive faster because you got a ticket and now you're late. So did you learn something? Did you learn from the punishment? And if you did, how long does it last? The lasting punishment is if you have multiple tickets and your insurance goes up. That's the lasting punishment. What it actually lasts in your head is that police officers are bad and that they're the punisher until you need them. So if you're driving down the road and the police officer pulls out behind you, you don't want to be anywhere near them. That's a bad thing. I know that whenever there's a levy up for us to vote in more police officers and more money, you know what? I usually vote for that. I like safety and security. I'm a big fan. When I need an officer, I want them there immediately, as long as they're not following me on the road. Now I don't want to have anything to do with them. I've been known to turn off a road just so that they'll go by, because I perceive them as a punisher, even though I'm a law-abiding citizen, right? I have 0 criminal history, yet I'm afraid of the police following me too close. License is good, insurance is good, tags are good, car is good. Why am I worried? Right? It's called a police escort. Isn't that the safest place to be, is to have one right by you? That's how the president travels. So the punishment then doesn't address the root of the problem. The root of the problem for me personally is I need to get up earlier. I need to not go so fast. I need to pay more attention, right? I need to have my phone on silence anytime I'm in the car. To avoid the punishment is just a piece of the puzzle. It's lifestyle change, because it hasn't changed me in my, who knows, 35, 40 years of driving. So what if that same police officer pulled you over when you didn't think you were doing anything wrong? And he pulls you over and he says, sir, I just wanted to come up to you and say you are doing such a fantastic job. And I see that you're heading on I-5 North, and maybe you should stop at Ale and A and get yourself a dinner. And I'd be like, well, thanks. Thanks, officer. That's amazing. In fact, better yet, why don't you take the whole family out to dinner? Here's $100, son. Go ahead. Take the family out to dinner. Because you are being a law-abiding citizen and you're showing other people how to follow the rules. I want you to do that. So you may complain when you get a ticket and tell a few people, but if you got pulled over and were given a gift by a police officer, how many people would you tell? how long would that story last?
It'd be all over Facebook.
It would, yeah, exactly. And they would want to know which officer was it and what road were you on, because I'm taken that way. Rather than, that's where the police sit, don't go that way. That's the problem with punishment. That's the best way we can understand it, is that punishment isn't durable. It doesn't generalize. We see the person as a punisher. We're not teaching when we're punishing, and it doesn't address the root of the problem, which is, why is that person engaging in the behavior in the first place? It doesn't mean that it should be eliminated from life, right? But it's certainly not a teaching skill. The person has to have all of those things in order for that to be effective. And unfortunately, most of us don't have all our things in order, or we wouldn't engage in that in the first place. So next slide, please. So this is kind of the beginning of, we like to use those big words, functional assessment. And I like to essentially simplify that, because it can be such a complex process. And I think as soon as we can break it down into very small components, it's a lot easier for us to practically implement. We're more happy to do it. And what you realize is you do this every day in your head. You're just not keeping data. You're not writing it down. You're not doing all the things that make it something that could be generalized, could be put into a plan, could be a long-term support, could be something that you could teach others. So that's why when we use the functional assessments that we do all of those things, because it becomes more durable. And then we can prove it right or wrong. So next slide, please.
I wanted to ask a question maybe before you hopped into functional
Yeah.
assessment. There was a question in the chat box that asked if you could use an actual example of a behavior.
Wow. I have so many millions of them. I guess the most recent one is kind of ironic. So with this pandemic and kids coming back to school, I was working in a classroom, which is kind of a combo class of individuals who would be involved in the juvenile justice system, as well as individuals who are on the higher communication scale and experiencing autism spectrum disorder. So you've got this weird dynamic of kids in this room who are all coming back from, a year of difficulty with Zoom. And so one of the young men came back, and he was not really engaged. And unfortunately for me, he wasn't a kid that I was assigned to work with. He was more of a juvenile justice kid. And so after being in school for a couple of weeks, I realized, oh, where is he? He's gone. He's not back. And the next week, he's still not back. And the week after that, he's still not back. And then, of course, the juvenile justice system retrieves him and brings him back to school. He had skipped for 3 weeks after being out for, the better part of a year. I asked the teacher if I might, take my lunch and go walk the track with him and just figure out who he was, because he was being brought to school and he saw school as a punishment. Home on Zoom, he could just turn his camera off and stay in bed. And often when he turned his camera on, it was pitch black and he was pretty much asleep. So he was, coping with whatever he might be coping with. So the one day when he and I are walking around the track, I just started talking to him, and he was obviously, again, speculating at the time of some sort of Latin descent. And my wife is Mexican. And so we just started talking about food and all the things we eat and all the things we love. And then we started talking about music and all the things. And next thing you know, he's telling me about what he wants to become. what he wants to do. He's telling me about the movies he makes. And I said, oh, I would love to see some of the movies you're doing. You know, that's really impressive. And then I started telling him that my brother makes movies. My brother's a special effects guy, and he did The Librarians, and he did Grimm. And he's like, are you kidding me? And so we just decided that we would connect every time that I was there. But I couldn't tell him what my schedule was because I didn't know. Every week is different. That connection of just trying to inspire him to say, hey, on your breaks, let's work on movies, or on, you know, I'm totally interested in that, or let's exchange food. Let's exchange thoughts. Let's talk about our families and the culture and connecting. And he was just used to coming to either juvenile justice or school. And it was really about, do your work, do your work, do your work, do your work. You're skipping, you're in trouble. Now I have to supervise you, versus why do you come? And I've had lots of experiences like that as to why do you come? Why do you show up to anything? So to simplify that, we say, how come you don't get rewarded just for arriving? That's one of the hardest parts, is getting out of bed, right? That's why Zoom is either a benefit or a difficulty for people, is because getting out of bed is hard. And that's just part of what we have to do, right? But it's all the aspects of life that get involved with us. So if you think about just rewarding people for showing up, I know some of you have heard me say, when I was younger and you moved into a new neighborhood, people brought you cookies. People came and visited. People brought you stuff just for showing up. Now you don't even know your neighbors half the time, unless you live there a long time. But you move into a new place and nobody might come over. It's a cultural difference that we're starting to experience, this distance, this avoidance, and this difficulty with just reinforcement for being present. So that's where I go to all the time, is how do you reinforce people for showing up? How do you build that relationship? How do you, it doesn't have to be money or gift cards or any of those things. And we'll get into that further actually in this presentation too. So thanks for the question. So functional assessment is not a process. It's not an end result. The most effective PBIS plan has an outcome that still requires review and revision. So even when you're done, we all grow and change and mature, and we're subject to new challenges and new environmental stimulus and new relationships. So the whole process for us and how we react to things continues to change. So how you support, your significant other, your kids, it adjusts. Just like if you have multiple kids, how you have to raise them differently, right? They may be of the same genetic makeup. They may be raising in the same environment, but you get to do it the same way, because that individualization process. So we morph, and we're very unique people. So next slide. So to simplify functional assessment, this is the easiest way I do it, is I look at the person's best day. So check out their schedule on their very best day. When are they happiest? I often measure it like, how would I design their perfect birthday? How do they wake up in the morning? What time? What do you feed them? What do they eat? Where do they go? Who do they see? If you're trying to design that perfect day, think about yourself. What's your perfect day look like? How do you want to spend it? Who do you want to spend it with? Think of all the detail in that. Like, what makes you the happiest? Well, how do you apply that to the person you support? Then literally write out, if I wanted to set them off every minute of every day, what would I do? Where would I tell them no? Where would I get them set up for something exciting and then have it fall through? How do I bring those people who they perceive as punishers into their first thing in the morning? So think about that. Measure those two against one another, and then just start replacing some of the negative ones with the positive ones. That goes right back to Dr. Ted Carr's, when you increase their quality of life, you're going to decrease challenging behavior. So to me, that's one of the simplest ways to start. So the next thing Next slide, please. The next thing is something that I determined early on in my career before I even knew it was going to be a career. When I was trying to understand why, because I was working in a residential treatment center that they were like professional punishers, right? They were also professional reinforcers. So it was very structured and directed, but it wasn't very human. So as I started to question at that time the program manager, I said, well, how do we determine what our response is and how we support these young people? This is their house. I just come here to work. So I'm entering their space. And then I come in telling them what to do, when to get dressed and when to eat and all of these things, right? What we're going to do and what game you're going to play and what park you're going to go to. And I'm determining all this. So for the masses, because there was a bunch of them, and not to mention the fact that you all have to go together. All 11 of you are going to get in the van. It's like, there's people who don't want to be anywhere near 11 people, and they live there. So the first thing I started to ask myself was, well, how do I know when it's misbehavior versus just inappropriate behavior? Maybe something we don't like. So misbehavior to me by definition was behavior that is known to be problematic, yet the individual uses that behavior anyway. The key point is the individual understands the rules of the environment and deliberately defies them. The individual has a more appropriate replacement behavior that works consistently to get their needs met the vast majority of the time. So if you know the rules, you're an expert at following the rules, you have skills that get all your needs met within that environment, yet now it's probably more of a relationship issue, huh? Like you're targeting somebody because you're not doing it with anybody else. So that misbehavior is often, in my eyes, a conflict with a person or personality than it is actually a bad young person, right? Because they have all the skills, you're just maybe breaking all the rules that they're accustomed to. So usually when everything's going their way, the way they're familiar with, they're following all the rules, they're doing everything correct, they're happy as can be, they're getting all their needs met, and then suddenly something turns, right? Which could be, just a power struggle. Now, an inappropriate behavior is behavior that the individual may not understand to be problematic. The individual may not understand the rules of the environment. The individual may not consistently possess a more appropriate replacement behavior that consistently gets their needs met the vast majority of the time. So if you don't have the skills in communication, self-regulation, problem solving, crisis management, choice making, right? If you don't have all these skills, well, you're going to be engaged in inappropriate behavior quite a bit. When I worked for the state, I showed up to work every day in a suit and tie because I thought that's what government work was. I thought I needed to dress nice because I was representing the government. Because everybody on TV I saw dressed nice and represented the government in a suit and tie, right? And my supervisor, after a couple of weeks, came over to me and says, that's not how we dress around here. You're working with clients. You're going into their homes. That's a kind of a classist way to dress. I want you to put away all the ties. You don't need a button-up shirt. You can wear jeans and just wear what you'd be comfortable in, clean, respectable, but not belittling. That was inappropriate behavior. That was not my desire. So I changed that practice. The only time I wear a tie now is if I have to go to a court and be a witness, or I'm representing someone in an IEP or something like that, where I have to show demonstrate status for people who don't know me. I don't dress up for people who know me. And I certainly shouldn't dress up to intimidate people who don't know me, because that's inappropriate. And I didn't know that. So all these things you learn as you go through life. So all of these young people that we're supporting, most of their behavior is just inappropriate behavior. They haven't been taught. So next slide, please. So the functional alternative skills that we have to measure to say, do they have these? Well, does the individual have problem-solving skills? Think about the people, and I detest the word, but I don't have another great one to use right here. It's a neurotypical world, right? Take all of your friends and family. Do they all have these skills? Do I have all these skills? Can I 100% always solve every problem and communicate when I'm in a problem? Do I always have good choice-making skills? Well, sometimes I can't choose what to eat for dinner. Certainly not to serve 3 people. Anger and impulse control. Do you always have control? How about the individual you support? Do they have the ability to relax? Waiting? Or does that prompt challenging behavior because they don't have the skill? Self-management, control, the ability to get from point A to point B with no support, to organize and be proactive and have all your materials ready at the time you're supposed to be ready. Functional communication, even in crisis. And lastly, and sometimes most difficultly, social skills, at which we all fail at. And I hope that we don't fail at it because we're engaging in misbehavior, that we fail at it because we didn't know what else to do at the time. I always say, I ran out of tools. If you run out of tools in your toolbox, often you'll go back to the way you were raised. And you'll go, oh gosh, I sound just like my mother or father. Now, most of the time that's good. But sometimes when you say that, it's because you didn't want to sound like that. And that means you need alternative skills. You need a better skill set. Next slide. I have yet to meet anybody who has all of those skills. And I'm not talking about the people I work for. I'm talking to anybody. So we all engage in inappropriate behavior, which means we all need to learn, and we all need to, be supported to learn more and to be communicated to directly, and supported in that communication rather than punished in that communication because we made a mistake. So the guiding principle, social behavior skills, like teaching academic skills. Sometimes we tell, we model, we explain, or we visually show. Right? All of those skills, you have to use multimodality communication to demonstrate for the person's learning style. You'll see it later in this slide. I say it all the time, telling isn't teaching. So what I'm doing for you today is just telling you, right? Until you implement it, come back to me with questions. What should I do here, right? All that individual stuff. I'm just giving you the foundation of the house. This is not a place you can live in. It still needs walls. It still needs a roof. It still needs an interior. Hopefully heat. All of those factors. We involve ourselves in guided practice. We demonstrate. I work with a couple of young men right now that I take them into the community and we practice. And we draft it out in the car. Okay, you're going to go in here and this is how you're going to order. And if you think that girl's attractive, this is what you're going to say. And, don't force her to take your business card. And, there's a lot of details in these guided practices. And then we go back to the car and we debrief and without blame, and we review, okay, what could you have done different? And, where did you stumble? And, how did that whole social thing go for you emotionally? And, are you up for trying it again? And here's what we could do. And we draw it out. Okay, here she is. Can you both communicate with her and order your coffee? Because that's multitasking. I want the coffee, but I really want to talk to her. So I'm going to stumble over my coffee order because I'm so worried about her. When if it was just a guy I'm not attracted to, well, guess what? He would just order his coffee. And those are details. Life is full of details. And and how do you not look like a creeper? That's what we always say. How do you not look like a creeper? Well, the first thing is you take somebody with you, because creepers are usually alone. It's just, how do you diagram out what that looks like? Where is that? Where's your wingman? Because if you're learning it, and you're failing at it, then it looks even more awkward when you're alone. So just kind of going through those kind of guided practice, monitoring and assessing like we do in the car, giving positive feedback. Oh my gosh, that was the best. You nailed it. She's likely going to send you an email. That kind of thing. Adjust and enhance. So, okay, well now what do you talk about? For that person, now that you've seen them 5 times, you don't ask them what their name is anymore, right? Your scripts change. Now you need to ask them, what do you remember about them from last time you talked to them? How are the kids? Right? Have you come up with any new drinks? That kind of thing. So everything's about support and how do you teach? And sometimes, even though that's a very general one and it doesn't seem like, super challenging behavior, for the individual, when they're focusing on relationships, it's the most important thing for them that they want to learn. I want to have friends and I need your help. And can you imagine how hard that would be to say? That would be really tough. Okay, next slide, please.
Sag, there's a question in the chat box that says, my 18-year-old son who has autism and ID consistently fidgets, twirls, runs hands through, and puts an excess of products, which are greasy, in his hair on a daily basis. Affects his ability to concentrate, I feel. I'm also concerned of physical appearance relating to getting a job. Is this an example of inappropriate behavior? And do you feel it should be addressed? ABA therapy has tried to address it and it went south, and it has been going on for years.
Yeah, absolutely. And every bit of those examples might have a different origin. So often when I work with OTs, occupational therapists, and we're talking about sensory issues, coping strategies, etc., where people use, whether they're hypo or hypersensitive, so they seek or they avoid certain sensory experiences. Often it's a calming technique, a way to cope with change and stress and all of those things. So if you can find appropriate replacements for that while you're trying to treat the stress and anxiety that's likely, again, I'm saying likely because this isn't an individualized discussion, but likely the culprit. And then also however that individual learns best, to be able to use anything from social stories to thought bubbles, cartoon strips, to show the perspective of other people. So what other people see in hair and hair products, etc. I think those are things that are really important for us to not judge, but to teach, and then allow people to make their own decisions as to what they want to do. I was a kid who had every possible hair style that there was, colors, mohawks, you name it. I was that kid, because it was interesting to me. It also, I think, protected me from the social situations that I struggled with myself. So even once they learn that may be a tool of avoidance, it may very well be that you have to replace that with another tool of avoidance. If they seek relationships and that's a barrier, well, then it will likely, if replaced appropriately, be extinguished because of their desire for relationships. But they have to understand other people's perspectives, and that is something that has to be taught. None of us just pick that up through osmosis. So did that answer the question? But it sounds like an OT related issue for the sensory aspects, and it sounds like the social hidden curriculum information for the relationship and other people's perspectives issue, and then you have to address potential anxiety and stress. So that's the issue. Yeah, that's the any of this is everything is something that morphs, right? We start one activity to cope with another, and then that might meet a need for something else. And then it just starts to create this huge coping, set of strategies. So I would, strongly suggest you have to piece it apart. Once things go on for a long time, if it's something new and just started, it's much easier to get to the root of where it began. But if it's something that's been going on for years, it's much harder. You got to kind of break it apart. It's like peeling the layers of the onion. So when we talk about power struggles, here's some of the reasons why people engage in power struggles. And the funny thing is that we start engaging in power struggles in infancy. We start establishing our identity as soon as we can shake our head no, as soon as we can scream and cry for something we don't like. So that's just learning to be independent. And for those of you who still have, parents or significant others who sometimes act like parents, you're still doing this. You're still learning to be independent. We struggle with it all the time. Don't tell me what to do. Right? I mean, don't put it that way. And that creates power struggles. Often it's a reaction to change and confusion, in which we've had a ton of this year, right? Fear and stress around COVID-19 and changes to our structure, our relationships, everything. Not to mention, sensory, having to wear masks or gloves or wash hands and socially distant. I mean, all that was kind of out of the blue for us as a culture. Often we power struggle because we're asked to cooperate too often. And I know later in this, I have where in your environment, if the individual doesn't have a place in their environment where they're allowed to be independent. I mean, think about it. At what point do you stop walking into your kid's room and you just knock? And if they say go away, do you actually listen? And if they're an adult, is that still happening? And can they have personal space? What's their identity within their environment? So thus cooperation has been demanded. They've been punished harshly or hurt. Sometimes that's emotional, whether that be in public or in person. Their ideas are not respected. Their choices are not honored. It's one thing to ask someone what they want to do. It's another thing to tell them no after you've asked them. So if I say, what do you want to do today? And you say Disneyland, nope, that's not it. I might need to really tell you what your options are. I might need to show you what your options are. If Disneyland's not on there and that's where you want to go, well, when can I go to Disneyland? How do I get there? What do I have to do to achieve that? Right? And once you take me to Disneyland, good luck getting me out of there. Because I waited forever to get here. And I don't know when I get to come back. And sometimes that's just taking a bath or going swimming or going to the park or going to McDonald's or whatever it is. I didn't know when I was going to get here, so now I don't want to leave. So now I'm going to power struggle with you because I can't trust you that you'll bring me back. And maybe it's not trust you, but you have not informed me that there is an exact date at which I get to return. So until you tell me, I'm not leaving. Show me on your calendar. Promise me. Give me collateral. All right. And the last one, which you're all experiencing every day, is stress. We can only handle so many things before we're stressed out and we start power struggling for the sake of power struggling. just because we don't have our faculties about us to be calm. All those functional skills, crisis communication, relaxation, self-management and control, right? You go back to those and say, oh yeah, those things are taken away from me when? So everyone you support is no different. They just may not tell you in the same way you wish they would. And the reality is when they tell us in more extreme ways, we find it hard to listen. It's hard to process, but it can be painful to try to hear. Frustrating, kind of what Liz was talking about earlier, how difficult it is for her granddaughter to try to communicate what it is that she's experiencing. Excuse me. And how hard it is to process that and get other people to understand it and help with it. So next slide, please. So as we start assessing ourselves and others, we get into the presets. Now, presets are part of what I was talking about earlier, where I talked about putting people in a box diagnostically. But if you don't have information about that diagnosis, if you don't have information about that person and their life history, it's very hard to support them effectively. So that's where all of the individualization starts. So presets are the things that you have little or no ability to change about somebody. So it's impossible to change the place you were born, the place you grew up. It's impossible to change your traumatic life history. Those are things you get through, not over. And presets include all of those things, including medical diagnoses, mental health issues, emotional, past, genetic issues, neurological issues, developmental issues. All of that stuff is what makes you who you are. So often when I'm meeting somebody, they start asking you some of these questions without trying to pry, right? Where are you from? They want to know where you're from. What do you do for a living? Because that might give them a window into your past. Sometimes they'll ask you, well, what ethnicity are you? I get that a lot just because I think I look, I don't know, different, I guess. But, they're trying to get an understanding of some of the presets. And when you tell them, then it does make sense as to why that might benefit them in knowing where you came from, how it benefited me with the young man at school recently in connecting with him. We went to, some of our presets, some of our cultural backgrounds, what we experience day to day outside of school. I didn't ask him about school at all. That's not relevant. He doesn't like that. That's why he's avoiding it. So why would I start there? Oh, what can I help you with at school? That is not, important to him. But our presets and our history and our interests and all of those setting events, that was what was interesting. So whether he knew it or not, we were really creating a relationship to support each other's behavior. Next slide, please. I've used this Gary Larson cartoon for so many years. I apologize for those of you who've seen it before. It's just so true. I've seen this still to this day, where you have someone who has trouble in class for whatever reason, and yet they're punished for being themselves. I will not act primitive in class. I will not act primitive in class. I will not act primitive in class. When this person's preset is primitive. Now, that in no way is representative of the people I support, but it is that they're punished for who they are a lot of the time. They're punished for a lack of skills. They're punished for their presets, their trauma, their history, their difficulties, rather than, supported in the same way. So next slide. I digress there. So the next piece, after you go into presets, then you look at setting events and triggers. So those are the changeable things, the things you do have control over. So setting events can be anything from, a lack of structure. COVID's given us tons of setting events, right? It's given us, fears of hygiene and disease and worry about our parents and grandparents and children, and that's causing a lack of structure and a lack of sleep and stress and anxiety and alcoholism and drug abuse, and all these things are coming up as coping skills for these setting events that we're experiencing, because most of us in this lifetime have never experienced anything like this. And so no one taught us coping skills for this possibility. And for the young and people who have less choice and control, it's that much harder. So think about the more choice and control. That's why I love my job, is because I have so much flexibility. It allows me to cope with these kinds of changes. I do see it as a challenge and a strength rather than anything ominous. It's like, whoa, gosh, I get to teach people how to wear masks. I get to teach people how to social distance. I get to help them with their anxiety around COVID. And then I get to the people I support. It's like you're helping everybody everywhere to try to figure it out, because everybody's learning. So setting events like personal space and new support people, canceled events or activities, right? This accumulation. So I was writing down this morning because I had a morning, and a morning probably not unlike your own morning. So the first thing I do is I wake up in the morning. My wife gets up early. She leaves, exercises and everything before I get up. Sometimes the dog eats and goes out, and sometimes the dog doesn't. If she doesn't send me a text to tell me that the dog's already eaten, well, the dog's going to try to work me for 2 meals. And that's a dog health issue. And I love my dog. The next thing is I went downstairs to the coffee maker because, yes, I'm an addict. And I go to the Keurig coffee machine, and it's dismantled. My wife had an issue with the coffee machine. I didn't know how to put it together. It was literally dismantled. So I didn't have coffee. Then there's a knock at the door when I'm in my underwear. And it's a tow truck. And it's a tow truck to take a car that I was having to the service, but they didn't notify me. It just showed up. And then I've had trouble with my Zoom camera. So I was kind of nervous about today, because sometimes I get on here and for some reason the camera doesn't work. So then I have to use my phone simultaneously while I'm on Zoom. And then my car alarm started going off in the driveway for some unknown reason, to where my son had to come into my room and said, "Dad, your car alarm's going off." So I had to run out there in a robe a second time to deal with my other car's alarm. So then I get on, I do my normal daily routine. I get on, I answer my texts, I answer my emails, I check my bank statement. I do all those things that, set my mind at ease, my coping strategies, as I usually would drink my coffee. So I even had to drive to Starbucks today, which I'm not a fan of. I don't like spending money. I'm a cheapskate. And I find there's a hotel charge on my account for $235. So I don't have to make a phone call to say, what the heck is this? And I'm on hold for 40 minutes. So if you think about that, when I do it, this is one way you might have seen it. So I don't know about the dog. I really need my coffee. Who's at the door? The dog's going crazy. There's a tow truck that I didn't know was coming. I'm worried about my Zoom. That's just a little one. The car alarm's going off. And lastly, I just got charged $235 and I have no idea why. So the last straw would be the triggering event. So should I open this and find out what the triggering event looks like? Let's see. Switched it on you. So the reality is, anything at any day can be the last straw, the triggering event. If you don't know everything that individual is experiencing, then you might be the triggering event and don't understand why. I was pretty irritated on the telephone after waiting for 40 minutes with a woman who wasn't responsible for what happened. Now, when she said, I'll have to call you back, and I said, you know what? I don't usually take calls because I'm busy throughout the day and I turn my ringer off, and I'm not calling you back with a 40-minute wait time. She understood and gave me a direct line. But if I had not been nice in how I delivered that, she could have easily just hung up on me and I would have been right back to square one, right? So often it's our people skills, our coping skills, our communication skills, all of these things, all of those functional skills we were looking at earlier that get our needs met. Because if we don't have them, people stop listening to us. People stop supporting us. And it's no different for the people we support. It's just more common. They get there faster. Their baselines are higher. So next slide, please. So there's a bunch of questions we have to ask as we're trying to support people. Does the person have the opportunities to express their opinions and control meaningful choices? I'm not talking about, do you just brush your hair or teeth first in the day? Do you have meaningful choices? Now, we start that way with little kids, right? Which one are you going to do first? But once we get older and more mature, it's like, well, we want quality choices. I mean, why else would I be going to Starbucks to talk to the girl behind the counter? Because he wants meaningful choices. He wants to pick the people he talks to. He doesn't want to sit home and wait for a provider to come. He doesn't want paid friends. He wants meaningful friends. What needs does the person address through the problem behavior? We have to figure that out. And we'll get into how we diagram that in a little bit. How will our actions positively influence the quality of life? Like we started today. Have people who know and care about the person participated in the process? Right? It's a collaborative process. And so just because I do the process a lot doesn't make me the expert. Just because you might be the parent or the support person doesn't make you the only expert. It's the collaboration of figuring things out. That everybody has a say, even though what they say may become invalid in the future. We have to hear it out and see what these ideas are of why it might be. But no one holds every piece to the puzzle. How will the approach, or how will the approach that is used affect the people implementing their procedures? So you can't create a plan and have it not work for the people who implement it or the environment that it's implemented in. And you have to look across settings. So if they go to work and they go to school, or they go to multiple homes, they go to mom, dads, grandmas, whoever, right? They go to specialty athletics and they go to dances, and will these plans work for them everywhere? That's the challenge that we have to address. Next slide. So what would you use selected interventions with for your family and friends? So what you write down or what you determine, would you use this for yourself or for someone else you know? Or are you really doing this because the person has a diagnosis? I have to weigh this against everything I think all the time. Would I treat my friend this way? Right? Even when I'm a paid person, I measure it against that and say, you know what? I wouldn't treat my friend that way. In public, wouldn't do it. So when will I do it? We'll do it in the truck. We'll go back. I'm not going to coach my friend in Starbucks. So think about how that is implemented. How will the behavioral interventions minimize the likelihood of crisis? And I often say, my one role is to not cause crisis, right? It's not just to minimize it, it's to not be the trigger of it. So that requires a lot of information. So you got to ask a lot of questions to make sure you're not the problem. So that's how I start my life. I don't want to be the problem in this person's life. So tell me what I need to know so I don't cause it, which is, what are the triggers? You know, what do I need to do to make that person's the best day I can make it? So next slide. So in this diagram, if you look just across the middle of the screen, you have all of the things we just talked about: presets, setting events, triggers, problem behavior, and then what we're trying to figure out, which is the maintaining consequence. Can we get that slide up for them? So as you go across the middle, you'll see the unchangeable, the changeable, then the old world, how we used to look at things, antecedent behavior consequence, ABC. So we know that if we get the information on this first set of 4 boxes in the middle up to problem behavior, then we start trying to figure out, well, why is it that they're doing what they're doing? So although we historically use the word consequence, I always use the word outcome. What is the outcome? Because the outcome is different than a consequence. And plus, our Americanized culture likes to make consequence a negative word. So even though the consequence of going to work is a paycheck, so we forget just culturally that that's not a negative word. So I use the word outcome there. So what is the outcome? Now, not the outcome that means what do I do for them or to them, but what do they achieve? What do they delay? What do they gain? What do they avoid? So there's so many different facets to this. So if we look at let's say the example of the sensory stuff that was being asked earlier. So if we look at an outcome for that sensory stuff, you heard me say, well, often there's a sensory component. Well, you know, sensory components are most often linked to presets, right? This is how that person experiences sensory. Hyper or hypo, that's a preset. That's why I said an occupational therapist, someone who understands the sensory aspects. So when I look at that, I go directly to, what is their body telling you? Behavior is communication. So if they're seeking sensory, then their calming technique is to provide themselves sensory. That's the outcome. Usually that is to cope, to relax, to control oneself, right? To control one's hands, flapping, jumping, all of the things that say, oh, I'm excited, I'm worried, I'm all of these things, yet it's coming out through my body rather than my words. So you target that in the presets. If it goes up based on environmental change, say COVID, well, that would be a setting event. So now you see an increase in this. Now it's morphed to different areas of the body. Then you say, oh, well, it increased at adolescence. Hypothetically, you know, when people started using lots of hair products. Or maybe their hair got long and started touching them in the face where they were uncomfortable. Or someone at school mentioned something about their hair. There's all of these different facets that would go into these boxes. The outcome is, are they trying to communicate that to us? Are they trying to seek help for these sensory issues? Are they trying to cope with them themselves? Are they trying to deal with their hair? Are they trying to deal with the social ramifications of what's going on in their life? So as you go through this assessment process, you're trying to figure out what it is that is the outcome. Like I said, if you wear a mohawk and lots of studs on your clothes, guess what? People are not going to approach you. So if you don't want to be approached by a lot of people, that's a strategy. That's an outcome. Now, the alternative, if we look at this path, desired behavior, we would say, oh, well, we want you to regulate your sensory. We want you to, you know, stop doing all of these things. We want you to not jump or flap. We want you to not put this stuff in your hair. And we will reinforce you with what? Right? Now, if that planned incentive doesn't match the maintaining outcome, what you're offering them is not the same thing they need. So the behavior is not going to change, right? Technically, we call that what we used to call a long-term plan, right? Long-term, we want these desired behaviors and we'll reinforce you in this way. But that's not getting the outcome they need. Their behavior's happening for a reason, to get these things, avoid these things, communicate these things, right? So in the bottom, that's the alternative. Why I showed you the functional alternative list earlier, it's all of those things. Is it social skills? Is it coping strategies? Is it self-management? Is it crisis communication? Is it problem solving, right? That's the alternative, the thing we have to teach. Now, if you notice that maintaining outcome has 5 different things that's morphed into, we may have to come up with an alternative for each one of them, because the behavior has lasted for a while. Therefore, there's a lot of outcomes of that behavior. Now, if it's very simple and very short, you may only have 1 or 2 alternatives that you have to teach, and you can get the same outcome for that person. Thus, that behavior will subside on its own, right? Because they'll have other skills. Now, what you don't see in here is the punishment box, because this isn't a misbehavior. This is an inappropriate behavior. And I would suggest that the majority of behaviors that you're assessing, you start with it as an inappropriate behavior. You make sure they have the functional alternative skills before you think about any kind of negative consequences. The negative consequences are often why it's happening in the first place. It's one of the contributing factors. Think about the police, our avoidance, right? The police are good most of the time, right? Yet we still see them as punishers. Well, it depends on the environment, depends on the relationship you have with them. I have a Homeland Security, I have a Portland police spokesperson, and 2 federal agents on my block. You think I'm afraid of them? No, good friends. Good friends. I don't like them showing up to my house in uniform or in a squad car, because everyone would talk. What's Zach doing? What's wrong? Right? But if they just come over and they're plain clothes, well, they're just a friend. So you have to have a relationship, and that's going to be a part of this as well. So next slide. So this is a simple exercise we put together. Now, this was put together for the Oregon Intervention System years ago, as I was on the committee for writing that. So this was one of the examples we used for the competing behavior diagram. So Javier is a teenage boy who was placed in a special ed classroom. Javier is diagnosed with a learning disability. He is becoming upset after his teacher insists that he finishes some very simple math problems. Javier's behavior plan directs staff to give him verbal praise for completing tasks when cued. Javier lives at home with his mom, and his parents are divorcing. He has very little contact now with his father. Javier has difficulty paying attention and is labeled hyperactive. Javier is bothered by the crowded classroom and the noise there. He can't concentrate. It's late. Javier wants to go home for comfort, and he wants staff to stop hassling him. So as you see this is a set. It gives you some presets of what's going on that he doesn't have control over. It gives you some diagnostic type information. It gives you some change setting events. It gives you some sensory issues that he has. And it gives you a little bit of information as to his learning style, or maybe some of the things that aren't working for him. So let's go to the next slide. So if you compartmentalize that information into this situation, you see that maybe he potentially has the diagnosis ADHD, maybe LD, and potentially depressed, right? He's probably stressed out from his living arrangement changing and not being able to see his dad. Unless there was a lot of negativity with his dad, and now he's stressed out because he might feel like he's the reason why dad left. There's a lot of factors there that we don't know, but we know we have to address that. It's late, it's crowded, and he has difficulty with math already. The staff cue him to work on his math. Javier tears the math papers up and throws them at the teacher. Staff direct Javier to a quiet area, leaving him alone. Now, the plan is for Javier to do his math quietly, and staff will give him verbal praise. Way to go, Javier, you did your math. But do you think that's going to be effective for Javier right now? He's got a lot going on. So is his environment a match for him based on his learning needs? Is it the right time of day for the hardest class he has? Is it the right environment? Being crowded? I often say that, when you bring in OT, PT, and speech language, historically they did pull out all the time. So if we feel that students, in order to meet their goals most effectively, say 30 minutes a week, need to be pulled out of the environment in which we teach them in to teach them, what's wrong with the environment? I know. I always say this, just because we've done it for 100 years doesn't make it right. But if we can agree that sometimes you need a more controlled environment and more focal learning for certain activities and tasks, especially specific individualized goals, well, then how do we do those same goals in an environment that they're always in? And that's the kind of teaching I do. And Liz, you asked that earlier. I'm the opposite of what most people do. I try to teach those individualized goals to the people in their environments that they're in, rather than pull them out into a more clinical setting. Because we know that that's such a short piece of the opportunities that our students have, our young adults have. What happens is their worlds get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The older they get, when all of the rest of us, our worlds blossom, and we get power and control and choice and driver's licenses and all these freedoms, most of the people I support are going the opposite direction. They have less going on in their life, less people that they get to socialize with, less opportunities to go into the community. Not everybody has that, but a lot of them do. And so for me, it's how do we give them all these opportunities that for some reason we didn't teach them when they were in school. When we had free and appropriate, how come it wasn't happening then? And it's not a knock on school. It's just we do have to look at everything in that context of just because we've done it for 100 years doesn't make it right. Right? We have to individualize these things. So how you would individualize this would be you wouldn't teach math at that hour in that time frame with that population. You would definitely address the presets before you would even think that math is going to happen. So unless you're targeting, his presets of ADHD, LD, and depression regarding the change in his home life, meaning you have to have a quality relationship with him. So when I went for a walk on the track with that young man, I knew I couldn't help him until I knew who he was. And ironically, just knowing who he was is what helped him. So now he doesn't want to do math still. I didn't fix that. But he wants to talk, he wants to connect, and he wants to come to school. That's what got fixed first. So in this case here, we teach Javier to ask to read instead, because it's still you know, it's still an academic task. Because of the environment being in school, we like kids to engage in academic tasks, right? And like at home, I want you to learn chores. I want you to learn how to do things around the house. So just because you don't like scrubbing toilets, maybe you'll like to do dishes because you like the water. But the toilet water, I don't want you in. So there's these kinds of alternatives that we say, oh, well, let's go do this instead. This is your functional alternative. So does that make sense? I don't have my chat box open. Is there any questions regarding that?
I have a comment. What you're saying is so completely, it's like, I feel like the 4th of July explosion, because I have this granddaughter that I have been trying to fight for 11 years, and her world has been ever increasingly going smaller and smaller because it's only me, and I feel like I'm the only one that keeps wanting to listen to her.
Right.
But she also has huge sleep problems, and I'm exhausted. You're the first person I've ever listened to, other than her speech path, that gets it. And it just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart.
I thank you for that, but I get sleep, so I don't even get that. Right? I just try to get it, to be honest. I just try to be honest and say, okay, I had a daughter who didn't sleep for 2.5 years. I know what delirium is. I know what falling asleep at stoplights is. And standing up, holding her and rocking her, but it stopped at 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So I always say the reason I do what I do is because you do what you do. Because I don't have that experience. All I can do is try to put myself in your shoes. But that's what this community is for, is to advocate for, first of all, the young people, which in turn then helps you out. So often in this crazy world of ours, I say, you know what, I might disagree with you, but I'll disagree with you on the side of your child. I'll only try to share what they can't share. I could be wrong, but I'm just going to always advocate. So that's kind of a place where I think all people should come from. Is that
But they don't.
The one person who is having the biggest trouble communicating is the one that we should all be trying to help communicate, right? Not each other, but your granddaughter. That's where it comes. That's, to me, that's the origin of what we all have to continue to focus on. Even when we disagree for the care and love of your granddaughter. Then all problems go away because we're only advocating for the same person. Maybe we advocate in different directions, but if we think whatever is best practice for that person, it's hard to really be mad at each other. And that's, to me, that's the last thing that any team needs, is people fighting when they have the same common goal. So anyway, I don't want to get into politics either. It's like, we all should have the same common goal, right? It's about people. It's about, supporting each other. It's about loving each other. It's about saving everything, because everything's finite. So we have to do our best. So next slide, please. This is one of David's great quotes that I've stolen, and I hold on to it forever. It's important to find a replacement behavior that meets the same needs for a child in a more acceptable and appropriate way. So if you can't think of an alternative to difficult behavior, chances are good that the child will have trouble learning one. Let you marinate on that for a minute. So if we can't figure it out, how are we going to help them to do different? How are we going to support them to communicate what it is if they have to bang their head on a wall? That's the issue, not banging your head in the wall. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we help you communicate? How do we listen when you do it? So next slide. Now, I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit on mine. I think this might be a good time to break and take questions. Are there a lot of questions, or do you want me to move forward? I'm trying to design this for you guys, not for me.
There's really only one that I saw in the chat box.
So I can go on for another 5-10.
Sure.
Is that reasonable? Okay. Okay. So next slide, and there's a lot of transitions in this slide. Oh, not this one, but the one after. So if you'd switch that. So if you look at this next diagram, you look at the top, those are all the boxes we've been addressing, right? That's the assessment piece. The boxes at the bottom are the plan. What are we going to do for the presets? What are we going to do for this kid around divorce, around depression, around ADHD, around creating a learning environment that, you know, meets his needs? So first thing we do is address the presets. So if the child you love has Rett syndrome and they've lost their communication, that's a preset. They don't have communication anymore. How do we support them with now helping them to master a nonverbal way that everybody gets, that you don't just have to be their best friend to understand what they're saying? Then you have to adapt that to work in a multitude of environments. With the setting events, what are those ecological and lifestyle strategies we're going to do? How are we going to create an environment for them that works? How are we going to remove the setting events? How are we going to teach them to deal with the setting events? To communicate around the setting events, those things that are setting them up. The last one, a predictor or trigger. How do we prevent triggers? And how do we teach them to react or have self-management around those triggers? And how do we start teaching that in a controlled sense, right? So where we can introduce the same trigger in a more secure place for them so that they can learn how to deal with it and deal with it in a context of someone they truly care about and trust. So they can start creating, again, foundation. They can start creating some sort of concrete foundation around, oh, I can do this. Because all of these things have to do with self-esteem and capability as well. So you'll develop learned helplessness if you fail and fail and fail, and you don't have successes. One slide I didn't put in here is you really should have 5 successes to every 1 learning opportunity. So every time you perceive you fail, you should have 5 times that you perceive you succeeded. That creates a focus to go forward. I am improving my life. I am capable. If you don't have that in your head, almost no one can help you. Because now you don't believe they can. So we can't be the biggest limiters of someone's success. We have to help them succeed so that they don't limit their success as well. So the next box is problem behavior and alternative behavior. What are the teaching strategies we're going to do for these? How are we going to teach these functional alternative skills? What tools do we need? Who's going to do it? What environment are we going to teach it in? You know, how consistently are we going to do it? Do we need to collect data on this? Right? What are the goals for teaching Javier how to ask for reading? How do we teach everyone that that's okay? That when he says, can I read? You don't say, no, it's math time. Right? I mean, that's part of the deal. How do we prepare him for, you know, going home? Do we debrief at the end of the day when he's having the toughest time? And again, do we have a strategy for welcoming him for coming, for getting out of bed when he's probably depressed? Then lastly is the outcome strategies. How are we going to give him these skills so that he's not doesn't have to communicate through throwing or yelling or avoiding or stomping off or whatever it is that he has to resort to? I call it climbing the ladder of dangerousness. So if I whisper, even behaviorally, and you don't listen, and it doesn't get my needs met, well, then I have to raise my voice. If you don't listen to that, I may have to start yelling and screaming. If you still don't listen to my yelling and screaming, well, I have to start pounding on things. If my pounding on things, then throwing things, if those two don't work, well, then I have to start targeting others or myself. And that is learned helplessness. When someone starts to engage in self-injurious behavior, they stopped believing that you get it or will get it, because now they're punishing themselves. It's a very complex pattern of behavior, self-injury, because it also involves a lot of endorphin release and norepinephrine and cortisol, and that then creates a physiological stress cycle that people then unfortunately start to crave, and it becomes habitual. So then you have to compete with that too. So that's what I'm talking about when you get this layered effect of a behavior that's gone on so long because it hasn't been effectively addressed, that it keeps climbing the ladder of dangerousness. And it keeps adding maintaining outcomes. So the faster we target these things, the faster we're going to, improve that person's life. Doesn't mean that because they got there, it can't stop. Don't ever think that, because it's not true. Because it definitely can. It just takes a little more work because they haven't felt that success. They haven't said, oh, someone gets it and I'm getting better. They're like, nobody gets it and I'm going to punish myself. So, of course, you have to rule out anything medical too that would be related there. I have a ton of stories to talk about behavioral aspects that wound out to be something medical. Appendix, wisdom teeth, headaches, broken arm. I mean, I can go on and on about the things that I've experienced where I was called in for behavioral reasons and it turned out to be something significantly medical. Swallowed a safety pin. So some pretty significant things that, but until you do, one and the other, you'll never know. So, all right. So does that diagram make sense on how you put a plan together for each box? So each one is a separate set of supports. If you overlook one of them, it's going to be a lot harder to get to the outcome that you want. The functional alternative is the negotiation tool. They're still getting what they want. You're just giving them an easier, more effective and efficient way to get it. He wants to avoid math. It's hard. I'm going to let him do reading at that time until I can correct the environment, until I can help him through the divorce, until I can, move math to a different time of day, and until I can find the best person to teach him that he trusts. Then we'll start pushing math again. Till then, we'll read. And thus you will have created a relationship with somebody who they can start to trust you. And thus they may not still like math, but they would maybe want to do it with you. I still don't want to go to school, but I like to come to school and see you. So it's crazy how we all go places for relationships, not necessarily the activity. Especially now we realize how relationships are so essential for us all. So, okay. I'm going to stop there. I wanted to get into the crisis cycle, but for that and the plan, it's all going to be one, and it will push us past our 1 o'clock hour. I would love to take questions, comments, and just an FYI, my email is up there, not just for Liz, but for anybody who wants to send me information, a question, what have you. I'm happy to at least